complex, and this is a big topic these days, so very timely. As we go on to the next slide, I'm going to invite Jasmine Lee, another one of our committee members, to do the land acknowledgement.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jasmine Lee. I use she and her pronouns. Joining you all also from a rainy day in Baltimore on the lands of Piscataway and Susquehannock folks. And so, as folks are already in the process of doing, go ahead and drop in the chat. If you know the names of the lands from which you are calling in from, go ahead and add that to the chat. We obviously want to invite you to consider the lands on which you reside. We want to invite you to reflect, to know the histories of Indigenous people, and to know the current and present state of Native peoples in your region. I just want to name really quickly here that there's a lot of conversation that happens about land acknowledgements. The practice of recalling is more than just symbolic, it is radical. And so when we pause for a land acknowledgement, we actually bring voice back to the stories that have been invisible and unheard. And so it's an important pause. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move now to talk a little bit about DDNRC, and if we can switch up to, okay, all right. Okay, thank you. All right, so for the Difficult Dialogue National Resource Center, if this is your first time joining us, welcome so much. You can see our about DDNRC here, and it's so important to know that we believe in the transformative change that dialogue can bring, and we seek to contribute to higher education institutions and their partners. And we believe that this is an important way to address multiple and persistent challenges to justice and equity. On the next slide, you'll see that there are the main mission and value statements, and the main pillars are to promote equity, to lead dialogue, and to foster transformative change. We invite you to go to our website if you have not already had a chance to do so, where you can go more in depth on the information that's provided about the mission and values of DDNRC. As we go to the next slide, I want to just briefly let you know how things will work today. In just a minute, I'm going to take one moment to sort of center and frame this session for today. And then we'll have an introduction and terminology. We'll have a presentation that will give us a basic 101, because when we say free speech, First Amendment, what do those things mean? So we want to make sure that we define and make sure that we are all on the same page moving forward. Then we will introduce the featured panelists, and we will then have a moderated discussion with some questions. And as they are responding to the questions, we will invite you to put your questions in the chat. Also, if you have any questions during the 101 introduction portion of the session, we invite you to put your questions in the chat. We will have someone who will be gleaning the questions for themes, and we will try to answer as many as we can. And then, yeah, we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A with participants. Thank you so much there. All right, the screen is blank now, just on purpose. Yeah, you can go back to that just to take a moment and pause. So I need to do that myself. And we just want to center for a moment. Many of you may have been rushing in. We know that there's so many things that are going on right now, and we just want to take a moment to pause. So I invite you, if it's comfortable for you, to just take in a deep breath. And as you take in that deep breath, just take a moment to pause and just acknowledge or feel or experience whatever tension you might be bringing into this session. And then as you breathe out, we hope that you can release as much as you can. And as you now think about the topic of the day, important topics of free speech, First Amendment rights, and academic freedom. We invite you to put one word in the chat as to how you are feeling and where you are right now as you reflect on the topic that we will move forward with. I invite you to read what other participants are sharing and just consider this as an opportunity to listen and to express. And you may see some words that resonate. I see some of the same words. I have to admit that even though I've asked you to share just one word, I see many words that reflect where I am today. Thank you so much as you continue to share. Now, we began planning this session back in the spring, and we realized we had no idea. We weren't fortune tellers, and we realize now that it resonates even more in this moment with current events. So, in alignment with DDNRC's mission and values, which we just shared with you, we believe that dialogue is one specific tool that can be used as an antidote to political violence. And we want to start off with framing today where we are and in terms of how we are going to move forward in this session. So we acknowledge that we're here today with different positionalities and different needs as it relates to this topic. Where there are different needs that we have. It's not all the same. And we know that there are some people who have lost their jobs or may even be at risk of losing their jobs. So there may be uncertainty, as we've seen in some of the words that were shared. So we want to hold space for everyone, but again, recognizing that not everyone is in the same space, but we want to hold space for everyone. And we will provide an opportunity for you to submit questions. And we hope that you'll be able to walk away with something that you can take away with something that meets a need, big or small. We also know that with time constraints and the complexity of the topic and the number of participants that we have today, that we may not get to everyone. But we also will be sharing resources as well as a follow-up to this presentation. Our session today is not legal advice. I want to put that out there, even though we have a lot of people with law background here. And if you have legal concerns on your campus, we encourage you to contact the general counsel on your campus. The information that's presented today is as of now, right? Because we know that things are changing and they may even change tomorrow, even this evening. One last thing, we are recording. So we just want to, I believe you had to acknowledge that as you came onto the session. We're recording the session and we are planning to share it so that you can go back to it. But we want you to also keep in mind that the session is being recorded so that if there is something that you want to share that is personal, we want you to keep that in mind, or if you have any concerns about your identity in this situation, be mindful that we are recording. And also you can always contact us after if something occurs and you have any misgivings about something that you might have shared. Thank you. And we are going to go on to the next slide. As we were putting this together and wanting everyone to be on the same page, we had a student, Heather, a law student at the University of Michigan, Heather Foster, who volunteered to present an overview for us. She wasn't able to be here today, but two of her fellow students stepped in, and we've challenged them to give a 10-minute overview for these really important topics. And so we want to go ahead and highlight Daniel Kaler and Nathan Pitak. And please, if you want to pronounce her name, make sure that if I didn't get it correctly. So if someone could put the spotlight on Daniel and Nathan, and then allow them to share their slides. Welcome and thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. You got my name perfect. I'm Nathan, and along with Daniel, we'll be giving you a really quick crash course on free speech in general and specifically free speech on campus. We're going to be covering a lot in 10 minutes, so apologies in advance that we're moving quickly. I also just want to acknowledge that some of these slides are not the most accessible. Some of them have a lot of words on them. We made that decision knowing that the recording would be sent out afterwards, and we'll also be able to share these slides afterwards. We wanted to make sure that we get correct language on here. So apologies in advance for that, but we'll do our best to highlight or say any specific language that we're referring to. So to begin with, the First Amendment, as we all know, covers a lot, but in relevant part, it says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And it's really simple with that. There's not a whole lot more than that, but courts interpret the First Amendment with a few main themes in mind. The first of those is the desire to protect core political speech. And that's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's supporting your preferred candidate. It's criticizing a government official. It's talking about current events. And then while the government is ensuring this speech exists, we also want the government to not pick a side. We want the government to make sure that anybody can put their ideas out into like a marketplace of ideas where everybody can engage fully and properly. And so the government needs to stay neutral is kind of one of those other themes. Within the academic context, one of the main questions that you're going to see is a speaker, somebody who is asserting First Amendment rights, speaking as a citizen, as themselves, or as somebody who's a part of the academy, so a student or a teacher or a professor. So very basics. The First Amendment is in the federal Constitution and it is incorporated against the states. So that means that it binds government actors, whether they're federal or state. Also means that public schools are bound by the First Amendment. Private schools are not. Private schools often will post their own rules and standards about what kind of speech is allowed in their own rules, but they are not bound by the First Amendment. So we also think of the First Amendment, and at least before law school, I kind of thought that just meant you can say whatever. And the government can still regulate speech, even protected speech, if it has a really good reason for it. So think like national security, for instance. We also have some categories of speech that courts have decided have such little value that they just deserve no protection at all. And so those categories are all on the slide, but just as a quick example, obscene speech is something that the government is allowed to prohibit categorically. So you can't walk around showing hardcore pornography, for example, on public land. And so what that means is outside of those specific categories, pretty much everything else has some level of protection. So hate speech is protected, profanity is protected, just about anything else has some level of protection. That protection means that there's some level of restriction that the government can place on speech. And one of those most common types of restrictions is called a time, place, and manner restriction. And really all that is that the government can set reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner that speech is expressed. Those thinking back to the themes of not wanting the government to take a side, any of those restrictions has to be fully content neutral. So, for example, the government, we're at University of Michigan, they could say there are no protests allowed in the law school reading room. They would not be able to say there are no anti-gun protests allowed inside of the reading room, but there are pro-gun protests allowed. It would have to apply to everybody, no matter what the issue is. So this next slide, we're not going to go through. There's a lot of information on it, and this is more for your reference when we send these materials out. But this kind of gets into some of the details about what kinds of spaces can have regulated speech and what kinds of spaces have like sidewalks, streets, and parks that there's minimal regulation allowed. And I'm going to pass off to Daniel for the rest of this.
All right. Thank you, Nathan. So for the rest of our little primer, we're going to be going over some specific applications of the First Amendment in the academic context, and we'll touch on student speech, faculty speech, and academic freedom. So I'll be moving kind of quickly through. So apologies if you do have any questions. You'll be getting these slides that have some information in the notes at the end of this as well. So first, we'll start off with student speech. And the first key case here is called Tinker. In Tinker, what happened was there were some public high school students who came to class one day wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And these students were disciplined because they wore these black armbands to class. And the Supreme Court held that when the school punished them, their First Amendment rights were violated. And the key here was that the students were speaking. This was like core political speech, right? It's a cause that they care about. And importantly, that this speech did not materially disrupt classwork or involve substantial disorder. Nothing was happening at the school to disrupt the normal functioning. They were purely punished because of what they said. So the key takeaway from Tinker is that students, even when they're in class at public schools, have First Amendment rights. They can't just be disciplined because of the content of what they say in all circumstances. There's been some developments since that case in Tinker. For example, not all student speech is created equally. Lewd student speech at school can be punished. There can be disciplinary action. Drug-related student speech at school can also be punished. So for example, there's a quasi-famous case involving these students in Alaska during the Olympic parade holding up bong hits for Jesus that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And when the school disciplined them, the court held that these students' First Amendment rights were not violated. And there's also a little bit of an off-campus, on-campus distinction. So, for example, if you're speaking on campus, the school has a greater interest in regulating what you say. But if you're off campus, it's harder for the school to punish you for what you say. Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's not okay for the school to do that. It really depends on how disruptive what you say is likely to be in school. It depends on the content of what you say. So it's a very fluid area, but students have more protection for what they say on social media, when they're at home or something like that. We'll move on to faculty speech next. So the key case here is Pickering versus Board of Education. And this is a case that applies to all public employees, so all employees of the government, not just teachers, but this case does specifically involve a teacher. So in this case, what happened was a public school teacher wrote a letter to a newspaper that was published criticizing the school board's allocation of funding between educational and athletic programs. So just a guy commenting on, a matter that's like of interest to the community, right? This is taxpayer money. And when the teacher was fired, the Supreme Court held that his First Amendment rights were violated because of what he was doing. He was commenting on a matter of public concern, and the school didn't really have a good workplace related complaint about what he was doing. That letter didn't cause disruption in the school. It didn't create insubordination among the other teachers. He was just exercising his rights as a citizen. So in that circumstance, this teacher's letter was protected by the First Amendment, and him being fired was a violation of his First Amendment rights. There's been some developments since then. First off, some clarity on what counts as a matter of public concern. It's very important. So that rule that I just said only applies to speech on a matter of public concern. If that teacher had been saying something about his family life or some personal matter, that would not be protected by the First Amendment in his job. We're thinking subjects of legitimate news interest or of concern to the public. Another important distinction is that private conversations are also protected. So in that case, the teacher wrote a letter to the newspaper. But if that teacher had been having that conversation with his superintendent, for example, in private, and if he were fired after that, that would also be a violation of his First Amendment rights. So it doesn't matter if it's a public or a private conversation. And then sometimes speech doesn't fall very neatly into private or public categories. Sometimes what you say is both private and public at the same time. In this context, the courts may be more deferential to your employer, but it really depends. It's a very fact-based, fluid area. It depends on how public, like how much of what you were saying was on a matter of public concern versus private, and how much of a burden to the employer, to the workplace, what you were saying was, if it's causing like insubordination, for example, among your colleagues. Next, we'll very briefly go over some academic freedom concerns with the First Amendment. So the big case here is called Garcetti. And the rule that comes out of this case is that for public employees, speech that is made pursuant to their official duties is not protected by the First Amendment. And what we mean by pursuant to official duties is the speech part of your job description? So you can think of, for example, a police officer speaking to someone in the course of his job, or a doctor talking to like their patient. That is speech made pursuant to your official duties. The same thing applies to professors. The speech that you're saying in class is part of your official duties. But the important rule here for professors is that they have more protection than other public employees. All right. This is something that the Supreme Court in Garcetti specifically accepted out for a later decision. They kind of indicated that academic freedom is very important to the First Amendment. And so if a professor is teaching a class and says something and then is fired for like some, comment that they made, for like a political position that they take, maybe that's related to what they're teaching, for example, then that could be a violation of their First Amendment rights. The only thing here is that there's no case by the Supreme Court that explicitly says how much protection professors have in the classroom. There's the lower courts, the circuits have had a bunch of cases about this, and they generally come down like professors are, more protected. But this is definitely an active area of law still. And that is all that we had. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Wow, thank you so much. That was impressive. In 10 minutes, a lot of information. Thank you for making those slides available. So again, letting participants know they'll be able to access those slides after the session. Thanks, Daniel and Nathan. All right, we're going to move on next, and I will be introducing our featured panelist. And so I'm going to ask, thank you, Fred Lawrence and Richard Primus to come on, and if they could be highlighted, please, as our speakers. So Frederick M. Lawrence is the 10th Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the nation's first and most prestigious honor society, founded in 1776. Lawrence is a distinguished lecturer at the Georgetown Law Center and has previously served as president of Brandeis University, dean of the George Washington University Law School, and visiting professor and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2018 and the American Law Institute in 1999. An accomplished scholar, teacher, and attorney, Lawrence is one of the nation's leading experts on higher education law, civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. Lawrence has published widely and lectured internationally. He is the author of Punishing Hate, Bias Crimes Under American Law, Harvard University Press, 1999. Examining bias-motivated violence and the laws governing how such violence is punished in the United States. Lawrence has testified before Congress concerning free expression on campus and on federal hate crime legislation. He frequently contributes op-eds to various news sources and has appeared on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, among other networks. Richard Primus, the Theodore J. St. Antoine Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, teaches the law, theory, and history of the U.S. Constitution. In 2008, he won the first ever Guggenheim Fellowship in Constitutional Studies for his work on the relationship between history and constitutional interpretation. Primus is now a senior editorial advisor of the Journal of American Constitutional History. The students of Michigan Law have given him the L. Hart Wright Award for outstanding teaching on 4 separate occasions. His writing has appeared in many leading law reviews, as well as in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Politico, The New Republic, and Foreign Affairs. Opinions of the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court have cited his scholarship. His most recent book, The Oldest Constitutional Question, Enumeration and Federal Power, in 2025, is a challenge to decades of conventional wisdom on one of the foundational issues of American constitutional law. He works with constitutional law on the state level as well as the federal level. He has helped state government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and private businesses solve practical problems involving state-level constitutional law, both in Michigan and in other states. Welcome to both of our featured presenters today. And we're going to go on to some questions. First of all, again, thanking Daniel and Nathan. They gave us a short primer on free speech and First Amendment and academic freedom. Is there anything that you want to amend or share related to their presentation?
Well, I will say they did quite a nice job. I was especially happy to see that because Daniel was my student, not to slight Nathan. So we're doing something right. The only thing that comes to my mind to say, and I don't think this contradicts anything they were saying, I think it's just by way of clarification. The First Amendment protection for professors in the academic freedom setting isn't a function of the fact that the speaker's title is professor. That's something that universities do, right? It's a function of the fact that the speaker is in a pedagogic role, teaching, sharing, propagating, suggesting, challenging ideas. The fact that the person is or isn't a professor, does or doesn't have tenure, has implications for the way the university deals internally with what people can do. From a First Amendment perspective, the point is the person is engaged in the role of trafficking in ideas. And that's so whether the person is formally called professor or something else.
Thank you.
I would add first of all, let me thank Daniel and Nathan. Richard, you should be proud of University of Michigan. That was a terrific presentation of a lot of law in a relatively compact block of time there. Just picking up on what Richard started to say, I think there is a confusion that free expression and academic freedom are two ways of saying the same thing, or that academic freedom is sort of the special kind of free expression right that professors have. And it really confuses two very, very different kinds of rights. And I think one of the ways we can see this is looking at what the source of academic freedom versus free expression is. My free expression right is a personal right I have as a member of the community. I have the right to express myself, to say all sorts of things, smart things, silly things, true things, false things, even unpleasant things, maybe even offensive things, up to the limits that Daniel and Nathan articulated. But my right as a professor with respect to academic freedom comes from a very different place. It doesn't get measured on my right to express myself. It gets measured on the axis of expertise. It gets measured on the axis of the academic enterprise, which has got disciplinary rules, which has got academic rules, professional rules. So just to take a little silly example, but I think it helps make the point. If I were to say as a law professor that I think that the moon is made of green cheese, I think my dean would think that was a rather odd thing to say, but it would pretty much, we would roll on. And as a matter of free expression, I certainly would not expect the government to be able to tell me that I can't say that. But if I were an astrophysicist on the Georgetown faculty instead of a law professor, and I said the moon is made of green cheese, I should not be surprised that that will have adverse professional consequences. That's not protected by my right as an academic to say any old thing I want. In fact, the right rejoinder to my saying the moon is made of green cheese is not to say that that's a silly thing to say. It would be to say, how do you know? As a scientist, you're making a proposition. How do you know? And then I'd have to say, well, I don't really know. I'm kind of making it up. That's not how science is done. That's not how scientists work. So I would take myself outside the realm of academic freedom. So you hear many professors talking about their right of academic freedom to do things that are actually not part of their academic expertise. That's not covered by academic freedom. They still may have rights of free expression as any citizen would. And that's why it was helpful that Nathan and Daniel took us through Pickering in those cases that talked about the free expression rights of teachers, which are different from the academic freedom rights of teachers.
Thank you so much. Because we may have a lot of folks here who are in staff roles, like student affairs and working directly with students in those roles. And we are using the title of professor, but can you just speak to how they fit into this as well? So I believe you said that it's not tied to them just being a professor, but their role in the university. Can you just speak to that a bit?
I would think that by and large, their activities will be protected by free expression, but academic freedom is really about the process that protects the creation of knowledge and the discovery of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge. So those who are involved in other aspects of the university will have other protections. And as Richard indicated a moment ago, we're talking about constitutional protections. There's a whole nother set of protections that a university ought to have for its people. But I would not expect that piece of student life and university life to be protected by academic freedom. It's really specifically about the ability to try out different ideas, to be in control of your classroom, and to do the academic business, which is where we create knowledge, discover knowledge, and transmit it through our scholarship and our teaching.
I agree with all of that. In both directions, as with many things in the First Amendment, the rules are a function of the role that the speaker occupies in the social and communicative ecosystem. The role of university educator, whether the educator is a professor or a lecturer or whatever it's called, is to traffic in ideas and knowledge and so forth. And that is what opens the door to the need for academic freedom protections. When the university also requires to function well, a lot of people whose primary role is not about the advancement of knowledge and trafficking of ideas directly, right? It needs all the other people who make the institution run. And they have very important functions, but those functions aren't about the exchange of academic ideas directly. And there, the university, like some other employer, can regulate the speech of the employees so as to prevent damage to the function that's proper to those people's roles. Some people in the university occupy both roles. Sometimes I'm doing this, sometimes I'm doing that. And then questions will have to track what was your function at the time when you were doing the particular thing that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that last piece that Richard said is the important piece, and it's illustrated by Jennifer's very helpful question she just put in the chat. What about a staff member who teaches courses as a paid instructor? Right. So the question is not what does it say on your business card? It's what were you doing at that moment? What exercise? What were you involved in? A staff member or an adjunct member of the faculty, not even a full-time member, who's in the classroom teaching. That classroom is then protected by academic freedom to the extent that person is operating within the confines of the academic business.
Thank you so much. That's really important for those who are sitting here in different roles. We appreciate that extra information. Here's a question. We have recently witnessed some dramatic development on campuses throughout the nation related to issues of free speech, including most obviously and immediately the Charlie Kirk shooting and the loss of jobs due to responses to that event. In addition, we have experienced threats to DEI-related programs and language, responses to the student encampments protesting the situation in Gaza, threats to funding and research, arrests of international students, the pushback against the current administration's policies by Harvard and other campuses, and more. What do you see as the most pressing free speech, First Amendment, academic freedom issues facing U.S. campuses today? And then we will also look at or ask you to think about where do you see the most hopeful responses to those?
I suppose we have a couple of minutes to give a first answer to that because that's the first 3 weeks of my higher education
Exactly,
course that you just asked.
exactly.
But let me say one, I mean, the among the things that concern me about free speech on campus and academic freedom, I'll do one of each. And the recent episode around the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk illustrates this point that I fear that the whole idea of free expression, not just on campus, throughout the society, really, but we're focusing on campus today, has, as so many other things in our society, has now been uh, terribly and tragically polarized. So free speech is not a neutral value. It's my right to say what I want to say, but it doesn't apply to you, to your right to say what you want to say. And we're watching this work out in very dangerous ways, I think, where different people assert their free expression rights and then would cancel the free expression rights of the other. And sometimes in the same sentence, people are asserting their own free expression rights and would deprive others of that. So I think it is terribly important that we as a society, and certainly on our campuses, which are dedicated to free exchange of ideas, reassert a neutral view of free expression, which is why if you argue for the right of people to express themselves, about 10 years ago, you sometimes got criticized for being right wing. Then there was a period about 3 or 4 years ago, you got criticized for being left wing. I don't think this is about wings. I think this is about a commitment to free expression of ideas. Academic freedom, the major concern I would raise is that the core of academic freedom is the academic enterprise, is the business of the academy. What Justice Frankfurter, among others, called the four essential freedoms of the university: the right to decide who shall teach, what they will teach, how they will teach it, and who will be admitted to study at the institution. Those are core functions of the university that ought to be determined by academics on academic standards, not by politicians on political standards. And that is a very tough line to hold right now. So I find that to be a subject of great concern in the academic freedom area.
So I agree with all of that. I'll start and end in the same place and try to fill in some things in the middle. The place to start and end is free speech is hard. It's hard to maintain a culture of free speech because it requires people to be tolerant, and tolerance is hard. It requires people to be willing to listen to things that they think other people should not say, and put up with it, um, or exit if you like, but not to respond by saying people should be penalized for the expression of ideas or prohibited from expressing the ideas. And that's all very like easy milk toast civics lesson stuff to say until the ideas being expressed are things that you find really, really distasteful. And we all have things like that. Our commitment to free speech is tested when the things that people are saying are things that we really wish they wouldn't say and might even think that they're like quite wrong or even depraved for saying. Now, that said, I think the really important threats to free speech on campus now come from a couple of different directions. The one that I'm most concerned about comes from the federal executive in the present government. And it comes in the form partly of cancellations of large amounts of research funding, but also other kinds of cancellations of funding and threatened kinds of enforcement in retaliation for disfavored speech and as part of a program to try to change what is said and what is researched on campus, and frankly, as part of a more general assault on knowledge institutions that is trying to degrade the things that free speech and free exchange and universities in general are really good for and important for in a society. That is the thing that I'm most worried about. And the reason that I'm most worried about it is that the federal executive is very powerful, that we have a university ecosystem in the United States that for generations has been the envy of the world, in part on the basis of a very healthy collaboration between research universities and the federal government, where the federal government has funded a great deal of research generously on the understanding that it is good for society for that research to occur. And the federal government has mostly been pretty good about not engaging in content-based political censorship and deciding what gets funded and what hasn't. That is being unraveled. And that's a very serious threat to the mission of the universities and to the climate of free speech in general. It's the one that I'm most concerned about. The thing that I'm secondarily concerned about is a set of attitudes that I have sometimes seen on campuses of people being intolerant of speech that they don't like on the basis of their own politics. It could go right to left, it could go left to right, it could go in various other ways. I think there is often an attitude at universities that anything that a student wants to protest, as long as it is not offensive to other people, the protest should be permitted and conduct surrounding the protest should be permitted. And this seems to me to be a little bit misconceived in two different ways. The first is whatever protections are offered to students who want to speak out and protest things on campus have to be offered in a content neutral way. That is, if it's a protection that's offered to people who are protesting a cause that is dear to the left, the same level of protection must be offered to students who are protesting a cause that is dear to the right. And that's just a necessity of the free speech apparatus. The second thing is, it's not the case that just because you are communicating an idea, even a core political idea protected by the First Amendment, that you therefore have the license to engage in whatever behavior you want while you are communicating. So part of the really important presentation that Daniel and Nathan gave was about time, place, and manner regulation. So I have the right, it's a core First Amendment right, to say Frederick Lawrence for Congress, but I don't have the right to go through your neighborhood at 3 a.m. with a bullhorn shouting Frederick Lawrence for Congress. If I do that second thing, I should be punished for disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. I can convey that message all I want, but that's not a license to violate other rules that we have for perfectly good order. So in the same way, students and other people have the right to make themselves heard on important issues of the day. They don't have the right to trespass on to take over buildings, to trespass on property where they're not supposed to be, to disrupt classroom work, to disrupt other people who are exercising their First Amendment rights. There's a question in the chat that asks, is the interruption of a speaker on a university campus constitutionally protected expression? And it's a little complicated, but the basic answer is no. That is to say, the university can perfectly well make rules for communication that say, wait your turn while someone else is speaking. Because the goal of the First Amendment is not cacophony in which no one can understand anyone else. It's a communicative environment in which people can articulate their ideas, and that needs to be respected. That's hard. Free speech is hard, but it's super important, and we need, I think, to work really hard to uphold it well so that we are on principled ground when large threats come for it.
Iona, did you want me to follow up on that, or do you have a next question you want to ask us?
Iona, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I just realized I was muted. Yes, someone else was sending me a message. Go ahead, please. You can follow up on that question. It's really important.
I would just the piece I would add is that another good way of illustrating the difference between academic freedom and free expression is that all of the doctrines we've been talking about in free expression, content neutrality, one we didn't talk about but is a very important one, no prior restraints. The government may even be able to do something about your speech after you speak it, even defamation, let's say, but they can't stop you from saying it ahead of time. Those things don't apply in the classroom. The classroom has got content-based distinctions being made all the time. Classroom's got prior restraints all the time. You can't talk in my class without raising your hand. And if I don't call on you, you can't speak, or at least you shouldn't. If a student wants to talk about biochemistry in my criminal procedure class, I say we're not going to talk about biochemistry in this class. That's a content-based distinction, but I'm not going to talk about that. So it's a different forum. And so part of this exercise is thinking about campus in terms of where are the free expression places and where are the academic freedom places. And so in sort of broad cut, the quad is best thought of as a free expression place. And one thing we should just reiterate, because the University of Michigan has given us many of our speakers today, it's easy to fall into the habit of thinking the Constitution and the First Amendment applies to all universities. It applies to public institutions or to actions by the public. A private university and actions taken at a private university is not protected by the First Amendment, but most universities take upon themselves something very similar to First Amendment protections. I know we do here at Georgetown. So that's fairly common. But in a private university, there could be other rules that would apply as well. I think with all of these issues, what we do best on the campus, in addition to thinking of this in terms of constitutional doctrine, is to go back to first principles and the mission of the university. And if you look at most university mission statements of some form or another, they're going to say something like training leaders for the future, preparing leaders for the future, discovering knowledge, creating knowledge, transmitting knowledge. My personal favorite is the mission statement from Aligarh Muslim University in India, enter to learn, leave to serve. But in any of those missions, I would argue that free expression and academic freedom are essential. So even if you're in an environment not protected by the First Amendment, on normative grounds, you'll want to be protecting those rights.
I agree with all of that. I would say in this part of the conversation, one thing that every person on the call can do one thing that we can all do as a challenge to ourselves is ask, are there words, phrases, expressions, ideas that we think should not be communicated on the campus? Like, these are not things that a faculty member should say. These are not things that a student should say, and so forth. And then ask ourselves, do I need to change my intuition about that? And think, for the principle of free speech, do I need to be more tolerant of speech that I find deeply offensive? Because it's just so easy for all of us to think that the failure to respect free speech is something that someone else is doing. It might be something that someone else is doing, but each of us might also be someone else's someone else.
Yes. Very difficult, as you said. One of the things that we had at the end of that question was, where do you see the most hopeful responses to these issues? Are we there yet?
We live in an age of a tremendous amount of speech. I mean, unimaginable quantities, generated, by technological innovation, in every possible dimension, right? People who publish more than they ever did before. People who are not in the business of publishing generate more content than they ever did before in social media and otherwise. A great deal of what is generated, and here I mean to include things that are generated by faculty as well as things that are generated by everyone else, is not stuff that the world couldn't do without. The levels of social contribution and quality vary really, really very widely. And some of it is quite pernicious. The problem is that not everything that is pernicious can be identified as such and eliminated, right? The principles on which we do free speech presume that if we tried to eliminate the speech that was pernicious, we would also eliminate speech that we shouldn't be eliminating. That right, and so we wind up with a lot of speech that is, not really high value speech. Um, Frequently, I have students who tell me that they really don't like various things that other people say or podcasts that they can identify and so on and so forth. And I point out to them their remedy is don't listen to those, right? Don't pay attention to those things. I do think that the fact that so many people have gotten in the habit of producing so much content is a possible source of um, uh, difficulty in imposing totalitarian censorship on speech of a kind that we worried about in a previous generation. I think there's a different set of worries that comes about from it, which is that the principles of free speech are used to justify the creation of a lot of false information that makes it difficult for people to adjudicate what is good information and what is bad information. And I think that's a really important challenge facing us in the next generation that I will hope universities will be a big part of trying to solve, because it's the kind of problem that universities are the right institutions for solving.
The famous formulation of the free speech doctrine that Richard and I are obviously steeped in and comfortable with was from Justice Louis Brandeis, who famously said that in the absence of incitement of imminent lawless activity, the answer to bad speech is not enforced silence, it's more speech. That's a lovely formulation, but let me say two things about it. One is that I think it's a lot harder to take comfort from that formulation than it once was. Because as Richard just said, and I think he's got it spot on, there is so much, and it's so hard to get yourself above the tree line that antidote of more speech as the way to deal with bad speech is a lot harder to do now. And sometimes for students, for faculty, for all members of our society, there's a feeling you're being inundated, and why can't we just shut that speech down? And I understand the impulse. That's where it's coming from. Brandeis would have said, well, you give more speech. And the answer might be, well, but they've got a podcast and I don't. And they're affecting more people than I am. So it's harder to do. But still, I think it has to be the right approach in large measure for this idea that if we start down the road of censoring the speech that we, whoever we are for the moment, are confident is incorrect, it is a very short road from that to the censoring of speech, some of which we, now another group of we, will support. I've told every senior team I've worked with in each of my administrative posts that if all your ideas are good ideas, you don't have enough ideas. You simply have to try out lots of different thoughts and see what works and what doesn't work. And as often as not, a student will raise something in class, and I can see it in their eyes while they're saying it. They say, boy, this is a stupid thing. I shouldn't be saying this. And maybe the way they said it didn't exactly work, but then some other student picks up on it. And we actually have an interesting idea that came out of that. Whereas if that student had self-censored and said, no, I can't say that because that's not a smart thing to say, we never would have gotten there. So the road that starts with censoring leads to mediocrity at best. It leads to autocracy at worst, and is a very, very dangerous road to go down. The other side about Brandeis's dictum that I want to pick up is that I now understand it differently from how I first read it years ago. And that is that idea that the answer to bad speech is not enforced silence, it's more speech. I don't think it's just sort of like a bumper sticker, don't silence people, have more speech. I think it's actually, Brandeis was talking about a moral imperative to speak in certain situations. When you think things that are wrong, when you think things are evil are being said, well, then you can't sit back and say, isn't that terrible? And you can't even sit back and say, why doesn't somebody censor it? You do have a moral obligation to get out and speak. And when you do that, not everybody's going to say, well done. Some people are going to then think that what you're saying is wrong. That's what it means to be involved in the free exchange of ideas. It's a messy business. It's a hard business. Before I yield the floor back, I just want to pick up on Scott Riggs' question that he asked. Hey, Scott, if you were a student in my free speech on campus seminar, I'd say you ought to write a paper on this because I think it's a really interesting question. The question, for those who haven't seen it, if academic freedom applies to teaching and learning contexts outside the classroom, would it apply when they're part of a staff member's job description? For example, he says he teaches and mentors often in extracurricular settings as part of his job description. I think I would argue that's part of the work of the academy. And I think I would argue that if you're doing that within the way in which we understand professional standards, that would be covered by academic freedom. I don't think that's an uncontested position. And I think it would be really interesting to think it out. I wasn't being facetious when I said it'd be interesting to write a paper about it. But if you said I don't have a semester to write a paper, I got to decide how I'd come out right now. I would say that because that is part of what we do in the academy. It's not just the creation and discovery of knowledge. That's a big piece of what we do, but it is the creation of an educative ecosystem for our students and for our faculty and for the community to whom we speak. And so when you're doing that, I think you would be covered by academic freedom, which means what? It means if the government says, hey, you can't advise a student about that, we're going to prohibit you from doing that, unless what you're doing is inciting imminent lawless activity, I think you would be protected by academic freedom.
So I agree both that it's not a totally clear question and that the answer that Frederick gives is probably the right answer. I will say something also about the second question that Scott puts in the chat, because I think that this is something that's on a lot of people's minds a lot of the time. And this is complicated, right? And can't be, I think, fully reduced to algorithm for a bunch of reasons, but here are some thoughts about it. The first is, I've been teaching for 24 years, and the number of times in which this situation has arisen in my classroom is really small. And I would like to think that that's in part because a teacher can do a lot to create an environment in which those sorts of things are more and less likely ex ante, which is a really good way of handling a lot of these situations. And partly that can be done in ways that are somewhat counterintuitive for teachers who want to think of themselves as progressive educators in the student-centered sense. Because part of what happens sometimes in education that is trying to be progressive in the student-centered sense is you let the students talk a lot. And that's not the only way to run a really good educational classroom. The more structured your teaching is, the less you face this problem or the threat of it. And different teaching styles work for different people, but I want to put that out in the first place. And I want to also say a structured classroom isn't a classroom where you're not listening to students. I don't lecture, for example, when I teach, but the conversation is highly structured. And that means that when students speak, they're not just saying whatever they want, they're addressing particular things, right, for like purposes in the classroom. And that makes the sort of denigration that Scott is rightly worried about less likely. The next thing is every student in the class has a right to pursue education in a non-harassing environment. That's part of the educational mission of the university. That's required in some senses by federal law. That's applicable to pretty much every university that I can think of. And the person who's in charge of the classroom is importantly responsible for making sure that every student is, to the extent possible, afforded the opportunity to pursue their education in a non-harassing environment. But it also means that we need capacious understandings of what speech is unwelcome and unpleasant without being harassing. There are many legitimate issues of disagreement in our society about which many people, quite reasonably, feel very personally, such that the articulation of contrary ideas, even if done in a depersonalized way, is something that people can take quite personally. I teach constitutional law. We talk about abortion. it is the case that I teach classes and that there are women in my classes who themselves have had abortions and have all kinds of feelings about it. And there are students in my classes who are pro-life. And if a pro-life student articulates the view that having an abortion is wrong, I cannot conclude that that person is harassing people who feel that they had an abortion and it was important to do so and it was their right to do so. Like, this is a legitimate subject of debate. If a student gets in another student's face and says, "You are an evil person for the thing you did," that's a different thing. But it has to be possible to have that exchange of ideas without thinking that what's happening is harassment. And you can say parallel things about all sorts of issues that people feel very personally about on campuses. It includes affirmative action, it includes Israel-Palestine, it includes whatever the most sensitive issues are, right? It must be possible to articulate ideas that many people will really not like without it being the case that what is happening is the harassment of the students who don't like the ideas.
Thanks. I want to jump in. And so I want to ask, thank you, Scott, for those questions. I want to ask for the other, feel free to put other questions there, and we're going to hold on those for a minute and just jump back to one of our prepared questions. And I think we started to blend that in a little bit. And I think this will also speak to the fact that we have, our question 3 is, most of the people in this webinar are running and or participating in dialogue programs that might bring students and or members of the community or faculty together outside of the classroom. So I think that's why that's something that keeps coming up. And a lot of the things that you mentioned in terms of providing that structure, that's what we do in dialogue. But they're bringing people together to engage in dialogues about many of these issues like race, religion, sexual and gender identities, the Middle East, climate change, political ideologies, and more. And so we're constantly grappling with twin commitments of higher education to uphold those free speech rights, and also simultaneously providing a safe and welcoming learning environment. And so I think that speaks to sort of, this last exchange. And are there any other words of wisdom that you might want to share to help us navigate that? I think you've addressed it, but if there's anything else that you want to add that.
The problem is the hard work is all in the footnotes. I think we can all agree it has to be a safe and welcoming environment in the classroom. Just have to be careful what we mean by safe. And I think this is what Richard was sort of probing for.
Yeah. And the environment, like I said, it may be outside of a classroom. So these may be the after-hour student groups.
That's right. I think that's a very important piece, that we're talking about what takes place inside the classroom, where I always tell my students, you have an absolute right to be physically safe, personally safe that way. You not only don't have a right to be intellectually safe, you actually, I think you have a right assertable against me that your views will be challenged. That one of the things you'll experience in your time here is that some of your core beliefs will be pushed on and will be challenged. You don't have to change your views, but my experience over years of teaching is that you actually come out sometimes questioning your views and sometimes reasserting those views and actually sharpening them. As scripture says, steel sharpens steel. And so you have that experience of being sharpened from them. But that's within the classroom. Beyond the classroom, a lot more teaching goes on. Going back to Scott's question about, what do you do with the denigrating and harassing question? I think Richard's got it, exactly right when he says the professor's got an obligation in the classroom. You could take a little more control to tamp that down in terms of the discussion in the class. But that's not where the business of teaching ends. Then after class, time spent with both students, sometimes together, sometimes separately. What did you mean when you said that? Did you see how that affected the other person in the room? That's part of my job as an instructor as well. So there are a lot of places where teaching constructive means of engaging in expression in this very hard, messy, difficult, sometimes hurtful business of expression is something that doesn't just take place in the classroom. It goes well beyond that. And as often as not, and look, let's be honest here, the classroom spaces that we're talking about are not a cross section of the country. overwhelmingly, we have people who come into these classrooms committed to learning with each other. Overwhelmingly, we have civil discussion in my classes. I've been at this a long time, and I've had very few times where I really felt I had to, figuratively pull people off each other. It's just not how it's happened. But people get heated about issues like abortion, like Israel, Gaza, like climate change, like the death penalty. And so sometimes using the after class time to cool that down, maybe that was important on the issue they were talking about. My guess is they'll remember it years later for something much more important about how they had that kind of very tough discussion and learned how to have difficult dialogue. And that's a lesson they'll take with them for years.
Yeah, and I will say to our dialogue facilitators out there, those shared agreements that we sometimes will sit down and say, okay, we're going to have dialogue. And these are the shared agreements in terms of how we're going to listen and both allow the different sides to express and also to allow and to listen and to take that in, even if it's something that we might not like.
Iona, if I might, I want to give a shout out to the people who do that hard work on campuses, because my experience was the schools that did best in the period immediately after October 7th, 2023, were schools that were already engaged in that. And schools that weren't had to do a lot of catching up, and doing catching up in real time is not easy. That's a tough time when people's ideas and emotions are that raw. That's a tough time to say, let's talk about how we do dialogue. That's asking a lot of people. You still have to do it, but that's asking a lot. The people who did that work ahead of time, and so they had that to rely on, those are the campuses. Ironically, they didn't get a lot of awards because they didn't get a lot of attention. I mean, that's the nature of these things. There are the many schools where things moved on relatively smoothly in the fall of 2023. The schools we heard about were schools where that had not happened.
I think that's really something that's important for a lot of people on this call to hear. And I hope that people can take that in because it is hard. It is hard work. Richard, I know you may want to respond to that, but I also, the question that we had, forget the numbers or forgive the numbers that pop up when I paste it. But we had a number 5 question that we had, but go ahead if you'd like to.
No, I go ahead. I agree with what Frederick has laid out. I think it's important to remember that universities are supposed to be intellectually dangerous places.
Mm.
That's like they're places that new ideas are supposed to come from, and new ideas are challenging. And nothing is more comfortable than yesterday's new idea, right? There's to say it's very self-congratulatory to say, I'm on the side of new ideas and new thinking and against the old thinking because I am comfortable with the following ideas, which were cutting edge and radical, 10 to 30 years ago, but are actually espoused by a lot of the people around you now. The job of the university is to be able to nurture other ideas than those. That's why authoritarians want to repress universities universally. And it's why we can't permit ourselves to be comfortable in any particular set of ideas that we have.
Thank you. We, along those lines, there were some phrases that might have been seen as acceptable before. I think, in the here and now they're being viewed and treated as threats. So can you speak to concerns around phrases like from the river to the sea, or that people need to go back to where they came from, that these things are being coded and that students and or faculty are being targeted for this?
These are obviously the hard cases, which is why I think it is best always to take a step back to first principles on these things. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? It seems to me one very helpful thing is to remember that we start with a presumption in favor of free speech. Not every case is going to come down with protecting speech, but it's just a helpful reframing device. Otherwise, we get into the habit of weighing what we think of as good speech and bad speech and sort of voting for the good speech and against the bad speech. If it's helpful to think of this, there's a presumption in favor of good speech, and it's for all the reasons we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. The idea of exchanging ideas, hearing ideas that you don't necessarily like because they may be true, hearing ideas that turn out to be wrong. After we talk them out, we realize we disagreed with them, but all of those processes. When you have certain expressions from the river to the sea, which has been taken by some people to be a personal threat against them. Many of the people who said from the river to the sea, when they were asked about it, they couldn't tell you which river and which sea. What they really meant was a deep sense that in that particular issue of Israel and Gaza, that Palestinians have been ill-served and were not having their rights respected. It boiled down to that. There actually were many people who said they were offended by that expression who wouldn't have been offended at that point. I think the question you have to come back to is, what is it we would restrict? Actual true threats, I think, should be restricted, but a threat has to be something that's intended to be threatening, not something that an individual takes as threatening. It has to be intended to be threatening. So when you have encampments that make it uncomfortable for people to walk past signs they don't want to see, I think that is protected expression. When you have encampments that make it impossible for people to cross campus, that's an interference with their ability to move across campus and do the things that they want to do. When you have speech that somebody feels is threatening, I think that's the price of living in a diverse and multicultural society. When you have people who are actually trying to threaten people, then that can be prohibited or regulated. Are these going to be easy lines to draw? And of course, there are going to be times that are going to be hard cases. The only thing I want to say is that sometimes we make this harder than it has to be. Let me give one very specific example that I think illustrates the point. It's a campus where I was a trustee, not a faculty member. But as the law professor on the board, I was sort of the go-to-it person on a lot of these issues for the university president. He called me up and said that the president of the College Jewish Association had woken up that morning to find a poster on her door that said, you must evacuate your dorm by 5 p.m. tonight. All of your material, all your possessions will be taken out and destroyed. It was designed to emulate the posters that the IDF puts on the homes of terrorists and suspected terrorists that they're going to destroy the home. This student was very upset. The student took this to be a personal threat and said to the president, can't we do something about it? The president said to me, what should I do about it? And I pretty much said what I just said now, which is that it's about a lot of what the person was intending. Were they intending to threaten the person? Will they, on the other hand, intending to communicate something? And he said, that's very nice, but how would I know that? I said, well, you might try this. You might try this. Was this one poster put on one door of one student clearly identified as the president of the Jewish Association on this campus? Because that starts to look like a religiously motivated intent to intimidate. Or, as turned out to be the case, were these posters put up all over campus, many different doors, in which case it's pretty clear what you have is an attempt to express a very deeply held view on Israel-Palestine. You may think that's a good way to express it or a bad way to express it, and you may think they got it right or got it wrong, but that's not the question. The question is, what were they intending to do in that moment? So more often than we think, these things are not as hard to determine as one might think.
In a similar vein, I want to suggest that the question, is it okay, is it protected, is it not protected, to say things like from the river to the sea, it's the wrong way to frame the question. It's the way that lots of people will frame the question, but it's not the right way or a useful way to frame the question. Because free expression is not a matter of magic words. There aren't, words that are okay and words that are not okay. The question is, what idea is being communicated and for what purpose and what's being done with it? It's in this conversation, when I say phrases like from the river to the sea, we all know that there are quotation marks around from the river to the sea, and nobody infers anything about my views about Israel-Palestine based on the fact that I am singing those words, right? It's not the words that are either protected or not, threatening or not, right? Any such thing. There are ways in which words can be used and spoken that are threatening, harassing, deleterious to the educational environment, and don't have to be tolerated. There are other ways in which exactly the same words can be used that aren't like that and are perfectly legitimate parts of free expression. I think that university administrators, for an understandable practical reason, um, have often wanted to be able to establish boundaries about what words can be used because it's administrable. Because you can issue guidelines to people, right, and say, don't say these things, and then you don't have to adjudicate hard cases, but you don't get at what's really there. I think in the past, university cultures have sometimes made the mistake of um, of saying, here are words that we don't want anyone to say. And I think that has sent us on a path where the question is, well, what other words are there that we can't say? Whereas that was not the right way to do things at all. I think of this as the Hermione Granger principle. In the Harry Potter books, right, one of the conventions of the world in which they live is that you're not supposed to speak the name of Voldemort, right? Like you don't say it, don't say that name. And there comes a point at which this particular character, who's one of the heroic characters in the book, says, no, I'm just going to say the name, right? I think she has the right view. I think we shouldn't think of the words as dangerous. The question is what's happening harassment? Is what's happening threat? Or is what's happening part of an exchange of ideas? That's a harder question to answer. Sometimes it's less cleanly administrable, but it is the right answer. There's a question in the chat
Yeah,
about Texas A&M.
yeah, I think so. We're at 4:50.
Okay.
And I know, Richard, I know you have a hard stop, and we did have a few wrap up, and we try to really be with very careful with the time. And so if we could wrap up in 5 minutes, yes, and because there are a couple of questions in the chat, but yeah.
So I will super briefly address the A&M question and say, I am deeply upset and troubled at what happened at Texas A&M, as I understand what happened at Texas A&M for many reasons, including that it is not okay for students to think that the President of the United States has the right to make law and decide what can and can't be taught. And I'm deeply upset and concerned about the political um, interference in the university. And I think, if I have the facts right, that I'm deeply upset at the university's disingenuous excuses for the way it conducted itself. This is exactly the kind of thing that I am most worried about now.
Thank you. There was also a question from Craig about a scenario where someone called out to someone who was wearing a hijab and asking if that was protected speech.
I'm just trying to scroll up to see the question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll do it. TPUSA, I guess
Oh,
it's.
I see.
Yeah.
Right. Again, I think, I guess I'd say two things. One that we've been saying before, it does turn on what the intent of the speaking is, and if a student is genuinely being threatened, then that's certainly something that can be regulated. But I want to change the framing ever so slightly. I was one of those presidents or higher education leaders who had the opportunity or the obligation to testify before the House Education Committee. Not the first group that was the most famous group in December of 2023, but in the spring of 2024. A lot of the questions were about how many students have been punished, how many faculty have been sanctioned in some form or another. I think that's putting it exactly backwards, because what it's missing is the core mission of the institution. We are not punitive institutions, we are educative institutions. Sometimes educative institutions have to punish people. Sometimes educative institutions have to separate people from the institution, expel students or fire faculty. Very rarely. And by the time that happens, something has already gone terribly, terribly wrong. So I think in these situations, starting with the proposition of what is the kind of community we're trying to to build, and how are we going to do that is the better way for the university to start. Now, when you have students who are actually threatening other students, you do have to have public safety there to make sure students are safe, and students may have to be sanctioned for that. But you don't want to just stop at that, because I say we're not punitive institutions. What made somebody call another student a terrorist? Last thing I'll add to this, with a lot of these stories, and you notice when Richard talked about Texas A&M, and I completely agree, he kept saying, if I have the facts right, if I have the facts right. We all have to be very careful about judging these cases because we're not on the ground. We don't always know what's happening in a lot of these instances. Many cases, these are not members of the university community that are engaged. That certainly was true at Columbia to a large extent. And so in there, the rules will be very different. Everything we've been talking about academic freedom and free expression, that's for the mission of the university, and that's for the members of the university community. People who come onto campus in order to disrupt or to cause difficulties with students, they can be treated in an entirely different way, up to including kept off campus for basic rules of trespass. The rules that we're talking about are for the members of the community, the faculty, the students, staff, perhaps alumni, and other members of the academic community.
Thank you so much. Okay, 454. The challenge has been getting in so much information, but again, I see some notes that this has all been very helpful. And so we want to wrap up at this point, but also moving forward as we can share, if we can share the slides again. We thank all of you for coming. And for those of you who are able to do a group snapshot, a screenshot photo, we have someone from one of our committees who'd like to do that for publicity. If you're up for that, we can do that, and we'll take the spotlight off of the two speakers, which we can't thank you enough for being here today. We also want to thank you. I could, this is again something that could be a whole day, a whole week of information. But we also want to encourage you to participate in upcoming events with DDNRC. And again, I think there's a slide, if we could share that going on to the slide. We have a community of practice event that's coming up next week, which is September 25th. I'm not sure whether that slide is, but you will or probably received information about that and should receive some information about that. And we also have a slide at the end that has some resource information about the speakers who were here. And thank you so much for sharing that slide. And okay, we can actually take that slide off now so that we can get the screenshot of everybody here at 456. And then Richard and Fred, if you have any parting remarks with the 2 minutes that we have left here, feel free. And Jacob, you can go ahead and take the screenshot if you'd like. And if you don't want your picture taken, you can turn off your camera.
I'll just reiterate what I said about the importance of the dialogue building work that people are doing on campus. And for those of you who wonder if the students remember or if it makes a difference, someone who was a law school dean and a university president, my standard opening question to a new alum who I met was, tell me a memory, tell me a story about your time on campus. You know something? It never takes place in a lecture hall. It takes place in a faculty office, walking on campus, meeting with a member of the staff, dean of students, somebody who said the right word that changed a life at a certain point. So if you're wondering if it makes a difference, trust me, it makes a difference. A lot of our students are hurting right now, and the role that you play in helping them through this will be a little help for right now on a particular issue they're dealing with. It'll be an enormous help for a life skill that they're going to need for the rest of their lives.
Thank you so much. It's so important for many of us to hear.
I would just say that I agree with all of that. The work of the university is hard, that universities cannot run without staff and many other people doing hard work well, and that authoritarianism thrives on learned despair. And the thing that universities can do is not give in to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kelly Maxwell, would you like to share a thought? Kelly Maxwell is the chair of our board of directors for DDNRC.
Yes, I really want to thank our presenters today. This was really, in some ways, hard to hear because, of course, free speech is very difficult because we all have the limits of what we want to hear and espouse, and then what we don't want to have others espousing. And so it's a challenge to all of us in this dialogic world to make space for true freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and do so in a way that invites storytelling, it invites narratives, it invites opportunities for people to really dig deep and engage across those differences. So I'm so appreciative of today's webinar and appreciate all of you for being part of the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center.
Thank
Group photo time.